words for reflection this morning are by the Reverend Bruce Southworth. O source of life and love and beauty, may this be our prayer, to serve one another and all humanity to the best of our abilities, to avoid the superficial, and to love the dearest freshness deep down things, to be mindful of our arrogance and selfishness, to laugh together and share sorrows, to give thanks for the wonder of each day, to forgive and to seek forgiveness whenever we fall short, to make it known to those we love what our hearts feel, and to gather all of our strength so that each and every day we may add to the fullness of life. Maybe take a moment of silence to reflect on these words as they touch our hearts and minds.
Let the mystery be.
Always get such a kick out of that song, I decided to work it into a sermon and into the book I've been working on. Once again, it's wonderful to be with you here this morning and share with you some of my musings. As Chuck mentioned, about a year ago I got yet another book out, and I brought a few copies with me this morning. We can share a little bit of it here. In a speech he gave during the last presidential campaign, former President Bill Clinton used the phrase, "We who have more yesterdays than tomorrows." Those are the only words I remember out of the whole speech that he gave. And that's probably because I am certainly among the we to whom he was referring. And realizing that I'm kind of at that point in my life and have been for some time, actually, that was part of what prompted me to write this book. Decided it was time to do some summing up, which is not really an unusual phenomenon for persons in my age bracket. So I wanted to try to capture some of my spiritual journey up to this point in my, I think it's 73rd year. And when it comes to my spiritual journey, the summation that I make goes from the Sin and Salvation revival meetings in the Evangelical Baptist Church, my youth, all the way to the Unitarian Universalist ministry, with any number of stops and starts and twists and turns along the way. I'll draw on some of the sermons I've written and delivered over the years as a way of recounting my travels of the Spirit, and I realize that a lot of the sermons I'm drawing on are ones I offered from this pulpit, so maybe some of you remember some of them. But my wish really was to offer much more than just a personal journey. What I hope to share are some of the guideposts I found when it comes to finding meaning and purpose, spiritual depth in living, when some of the more traditional religious answers to such mysteries of existence no longer work. It's my further hope that some of the guideposts I found might be useful to those who read the book. And so the title, to start with that, is a straight steal from my longtime friend and colleague in the Unitarian Universalist ministry, the late Reverend Forrest Church. Forrest passed away 10 years ago, 2009, at the far too early age of 61 from esophageal cancer. Among the many books on liberal religion that he published in his lifetime was a line that read, "God is not God's name. It is a name for that which is greater than all and present in all." And I've long found Forrest's words very helpful, but I feel they take this whole belief in God conversation to a much more productive and meaningful place than one of going around in circles over whether or not someone believes in an entity called God. They get us out of a semantic box as to what the term God may or may not mean, and instead they call us into a spiritual journey of exploration for that which is greater than all and present in all. And if one chooses to call the object of that quest God, well, that's okay, that's all well and good. If not, that's equally fine. Because the journey, the search, the quest is so much more important than the terminology. So that's what the book is finally about. How do we stay on a meaningful journey of discovery for that which is greater than all and present in all? And how does that journey help us to better understand who we are, why we're here on this earth, for whatever time we're given to live our lives? And so I pursue this question from a variety of angles in the various chapters in here, and the chapter I'm going to focus on today is titled Belief versus the Religious Impulse. And in that I note that the thing that has kept me in the ministry through all my meanderings has been a matter of quite literally going beyond belief. For I found that while I could discard certain beliefs that no longer sustained me or no longer made any sense, I couldn't shake off religion itself or the religious impulse. And so in defining religion, I go to another of Reverend Church's well-known lines. Religion, he maintained in another one of his books, is our human response to the dual reality of being alive and knowing that we will die. Or to put it another way, religion is our human attempt, our human impulse to make some ultimate sense out of the lives we are living, even as we know we'll never completely figure it all out. And so for all the beliefs that I have discarded then, I continue to believe in this religious impulse. And one of the more poignant expressions of that is the reading that Chuck shared with us a few minutes ago by Ralph Helverson titled Impassioned Clay. I'm going to recall just a few lines of it here. Deep in ourselves resides the religious impulse. Out of the passions of our clay, it arises. We have religion when we have done all we can, and then in confidence trust ourselves to the life that is larger than ourselves. And that last line best captures for me what the religious impulse is. It's about looking up from our individual states of existence to a life that, as Helverson puts it, is larger than ourselves and in which we feel we can place some trust and confidence. Put it another way, the religious impulse is the drive to feel at home in a universe that still remains greatly mysterious to us and which fills us with awe and wonder and occasionally fear. Well, it's time for a little caveat here. I am well aware of the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad, thank you, Judith V. Orst ways and things in which religion gets used or make that abused. My knowledge of world history is enough for me to know of the wars that have been fought, the tortures that have been inflicted, the executions that have taken place in the supposed name of religion. In a somewhat less brutal but still unconscionable manner, I'm aware of how religion can be manipulated to foster useless guilt, to rationalize all matter of repression and wrongdoing, and provide a means for self-aggrandizement on the part of any number of holy hucksters who are able to convince enough willing followers that they possess the whole truth. Yeah. We'll get it later. So I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm going to guess that religion arose at the same point in human evolution when proto-human beings became actual Homo sapiens. This was when our earliest human ancestors, I'm guessing, found enough of a respite from their immediate survival needs so they could look up, look around, look at themselves, and ask why. This was also the stage in which our earliest ancestors' brains had developed to the point where they could ask, even in the most seminal ways, questions about their existence. They got some sense, probably couldn't articulate it, but they got some sense that there were greater mysteries in their lives, in their world, that were somehow just beyond their grasp. Now, there's a mythological recounting of this stage in human evolution in one of the creation myths in the opening chapters of Genesis. You got these proto-human beings given the names of Adam and Eve, and they have this defining moment. The eyes of both of them were opened, and they discovered they were naked. Now, this passage is not, as I read it, about a couple of mythological creatures seeing each other's bodies as well as their own for the first time and then trying to get themselves under wraps. It is instead a fanciful recounting of when our earliest human ancestors attained self-awareness. Their eyes were opened, and they beheld themselves. And this emerging self-awareness in time came to include an awareness of their mortality. They figured out they were going to die at some point. And that, I would offer, was the beginning of religion. It was when we began to ask why. So this debate over whether religion is a force for good or evil can be of some value when it comes to gaining a better understanding of how these conflicting forces operate. But it's a debate that will never be fully resolved because there's no final resolution. And the contention, I know, by some very well-intentioned persons that the world will be a much better place without religion. We can cue up John Lennon here, and no religion too. That really does not in the end hold up. For religion exists, as I hope I've just demonstrated or shown. It exists because human beings exist. And we have within us this religious impulse that Helverson describes. And while that impulse can and has been put to all kinds of destructive ends, it is ultimately life-enhancing, provided that we respond to life in enhancing ways. So yes, there are certain beliefs or life stances, there are certain practices, disciplines that can help us meaningfully respond to this religious impulse. And I address some of them in the book here. But part of what I'm calling the belief trap is the notion that a given set of precisely delineated beliefs can fully and adequately address this religious impulse. That is patently absurd. And it is this notion that lies at the heart of many of the abusive ways that religion gets used, that you can take this universal religious impulse that's been out there ever since we've been human beings and capture it all in some little closely defined set of beliefs. That's the belief trap. Well, rather than go into all the negative effects of trying to reduce the religious impulse to an exclusive set of beliefs, I'm going to try a little bit of humor here. While cruising the internet for some sermon material a long time ago, I came across a comedic category for the best God joke ever. I didn't know there was such a category, but there it was. The joke is, it's not actually a joke, it's a stand-up comedy routine done by a Chicago-based comedian named Emo Phillips. Several versions and variations on it out there, and I had some interesting correspondence with him getting permission to put this thing into the book, but here it goes. Once I saw a guy on a bridge about to jump. I said, "Don't do it." He said, "I've nothing to live for because nobody loves me." I said, "God loves you. Do you believe in God?" He said, "Yes, I do." I said, "Me too. Are you a Christian, a Jew, or a Muslim?" He said, "I'm a Christian." I said, "Me too. Which denomination?" He said, "Baptist." I said, "Me too. Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist?" He said, "Northern Baptist." I said, "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist or Northern Liberal Baptist?" He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist." I said, "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Baptist Eastern region?" He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region." I said, "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Regional Council of 1879 or Northern Baptist Great Lakes Regional Council of 1912? He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Regional Council of 1912. At that, I said, "Die, you heretic scum," and I pushed him over. Yeah, I get a good laugh at that every time I read it, and it's not to make light of suicide, which I know is a tremendously serious matter, but that's a good routine. And like most good comedies or satire, it has a bite to it, having to do with the absurd lengths to which matters of religious belief can be taken. And the not-so-humorous part, to which I already alluded, is that over the course of human history, particularly in the West, persons have been persecuted, tortured, and even put to death over lesser or finer points of theology and belief than is contained in this little comedic routine. And the means of execution quite often is far worse than getting tossed off a bridge. So for all the laughs I get from Mr. Phillips' comedy bit, when I place it in this broad historical context, it becomes a little less funny. And it also points up how an insistence on the rightness of one particular set of beliefs takes us away from the true essence of religion. What is this true essence of religion? Well, I've already offered how Reverends Church and Helverson have answered the question. I'm going to take another swing at it using a Latin exercise, going clear back to a high school Latin class. They still teach Latin in high schools? I don't know. No? Yes? Well, they taught it to me. And one of the exercises we had to do was to take a multi-syllable English word and break it out into its component parts, find the Latin derivation of each syllable, and then put the English word back together to see what kind of new understandings of that word we might discover. Well, here's what you get when you do that little exercise with the word religion. You get re, which means again, as in repeat or return. The Lygian part comes from the Latin verb ligare, which means to bind together. Same term we get for our word ligament. A ligament is what holds or binds your bones together so they work in the way they're supposed to work. Well, if we put these two Latin fragments together, when it comes to religion, we get to bind together again. Religion, then, in the most basic sense of the word, is the search for that which ultimately binds our lives together, gives them their sense of wholeness, and sustains us again and again over the course of our lives. Religion, in this sense, is a verb. It's an ongoing process in which we engage in seeking greater levels of meaning and wholeness. That's the process I've been in for most of my life. It's a process that can involve our times of incredible uplift and insight and joy, and it can also flow through some of our deepest and darkest nights of the soul. And indeed, our beliefs do play a role in this process. The crucial question is, what kind of belief? What kind of role? These beliefs can be stepping stones to a greater, more ongoing journey, or they can short-circuit the journey if one feels that any single port of call contains the whole truth or represents the final destination. And for all the beliefs that have come and gone over the course of my life, the ones I've discarded, the ones I've held on to, I find the words and singer and songwriter Iris DeMint to be very helpful, and they keep me honest. Everybody's wondering what and where they all came from. Everybody's worrying about what they're going to do when the whole thing's done. But no one knows for certain, and it's all the same to me. I think I'll just let the mystery be. I believe in love, and I live my life accordingly. But I choose to let the mystery be. Well, I pick up on this theme in the epilogue of this book. These are the words with which I end it, and I'll end up with them here. In my first semester college freshman English class, one of the novels we were assigned was Albert Camus' The Stranger. I found it to be the weirdest book I'd ever read in all of my advanced 18 years. It was something about this French guy named Meursault living in Algeria, and his mother dies, and he's not all that affected by her passing, and then he more or less stumbles into committing a murder for which he ends up being sentenced to death. At his trial, the prosecutor makes more of Meursault's seeming indifference to his mother's dying than to his practically inadvertent killing of an Arab, but Meursault gets the guillotine anyway. By the time I finally got to the last page, I was in such a hurry to just get done with the book that I'd read right past its key passage. In that passage, Mirceau is in his jail cell a few hours away from his execution. He's just had an angry argument with a prison chaplain who unsuccessfully tried to get him to turn to God while he still had the time. Mirceau then notes, "It was as if that great rush of anger at the chaplain had washed me clean, emptied me of hope, and gazing up at the sky spangled with its signs and stars, for the first time I laid my heart open to the benign indifference of the universe." As I said, I had no idea what I was reading when I read those words. I was still in a very early religious stage of my life. I could follow the storyline, bizarre as it was, but I couldn't see the point the author was trying to make. As I say, my mind, my thinking at that time were simply not equipped to even catch a glimmer of understanding of what was being said in this short novel. A few more years had to go by before I was ready for any kind of engagement with this atheistic, existentialist French philosopher, novelist, and playwright, Mr. Albert Camus. As I have moved across the various landscapes of my spirit, the words of Camus' Mirceau hover over me and haunt me. I, too, often gaze up at a sky, spangled with its signs and stars. And while I'm not in a jail cell awaiting the guillotine, I view these signs and stars with an awareness, sometimes conscious, sometimes not, of my mortality. And what Camus is saying, as I eventually figured out, is that for all of our searches for meaning, for all of our many fulfilling and life-sustaining meanings that we may derive over the course of our lives, we ultimately live in a universe that is as absurd as the situation in which Mirceau found himself. It is also a universe that regards us with what Camus, through the words of his main character, calls benign indifference. Now, on first take, the phrase benign indifference sounds like an oxymoron. Most dictionary definitions of benign use words like gracious or kind or favorable. How can a universe regard us in gracious or kind or favorable ways and still be indifferent? But there's another definition of benign that gets closer to what Camus is saying. Not malignant. We live in a universe, according to Camus, that wishes us no harm, but one that is simply indifferent to our existence. Maybe so. Maybe so. I don't discount the possibility. Maybe I live and move and have my being as a creature in a universe that's completely indifferent to my existence. But even if that might be the case, I do not choose to live in a state of indifference myself. Even if the universe is ultimately indifferent to my existence, I do not have to live as one of its creatures by being indifferent towards it. I find too much joy, pleasure, fulfillment, along with my times of pain and despair and emptiness, as I live my life in one minuscule piece of this vast universe I inhabit, so I cannot be indifferent. My counterpoint to Camus, however, comes from yet another of my Unitarian Universalist ministerial colleagues. This one was the late Reverend Dean Starr. Some of you may remember Dean Starr. He was the district executive here when I began my ministry in 1988. Sometime in the early 1990s, Dean lost a son, Paul, to the AIDS virus. At a gathering of his fellow clergy members a few years after Paul died, Dean recounted a story of how he came to find some reconciliation with the loss of his son. He told of how he took a boat cruise off the west coast of Naples, Florida, in the Gulf of Mexico, as he continued to deeply grieve the loss a year or so after his son's death. Here's how Reverend Starr described the experience. The entire sky, from horizon to horizon, with a glow with colors, reds, purples, pinks, and golds. Then the colors faded, and the indescribable deep, deep indigo of late twilight filled the sky. Then the boat turned around, and on the eastern horizon was a full and glorious moon. With tears streaming down my face, I realized that although my son's being had been scattered, he remained a part of this awesome beauty. We can never contain the beauty in which we live and move and have our being. Whether we live or whether we die, we're contained within this beauty. Dean is saying here that there's an uncontained beauty, a greater web of life, a larger chain of being. Some may choose to call that the presence of God, that holds us in our time-bound lives during our time on earth, and also holds the continuing presence of our lives beyond our physical existence. Catching a glimpse of this greater beauty did not remove the reality of the death of Reverend Starr's son. He lived with that for the rest of his life. But the experience he described reminded him, as it can remind us, that life with a capital L is greater than any one of us, greater than our individual lives. And so for me, this is what it finally comes down to. Is it Camus' indifferent universe, or are we contained within a beauty, whether we live or whether we die? I think on these things, for all my thinking, all my pondering, I end up back with Irish Dement. I think I'll just let the mystery be. Let's sing Blue Boat Home together. And now may the love which overcomes all differences, which heals all wounds, which puts to flight all fears, which reconciles all who are separated, be in us and among us, now and always. May we always be at peace with one another. Wonderful to be with you today.